It says it's streaming. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah. Internet, are you there? Okay. Why does it say offline and offline? I'm so confused. It didn't really go. Now it is. Now it's actually doing the thing. Okay, well, that's fun. It doesn't say I'm online, but it does actually show me online. So there was a discussion that I wanted to go over on the brain, the left and the right hemispheres. And since it look okay, now it's streaming. That's perfect. Well, great. And there's a kind of, as a teacher, there's a perspective that I have to understand from the student's side, right? You can't just start speaking words and hoping that they stick. Um, Not like a upload to a computer, or as if there's a computer chip in your brain that you're just uploading data to. The idea that human beings can use both sides of the brain independently, completely independently. In fact, in 1960s, there were surgeries that would fix epilepsy by cutting the middle part of the brain that connects the two hemispheres and disconnecting them, which in turn didn't change the way they lived, but I mean, it basically ended up splitting the person in two people. Since the voice, the vocal generation of our brain is on the left side, and our left side of the brain controls our right side of our body and also our right eye, there were cases where a person can see a picture on the right side of a screen and be able to identify it with his left side with voice. However, when you put a picture on the left side of the screen, why is this StarCraft 2 again? Hold on. Put it on the left side of the screen, the right side would take in that information. And the voice part would not respond, which was interesting. This meant that the communication between the two sides of the brain was disconnected, which was the surgery in itself. But the experiments showed that when a person registers information from each eye, it goes to the respective side of the brain. The person was able to draw with his left hand the object that was on the left side of the screen. Because again, the right side of the brain is the one that absorbs your left eye's information, and that happens to be where the creative side of the brain is. So he was able to draw the picture that was visualized on the left. But his right side, his vocals, you ask him the question, what did you see? He would say, I don't know. Which basically meant that his technical consciousness of communication did not register what was on the left side of the screen. However, the subconscious, the creative, artistic side, was able to draw the exact object, even though he did not know what it was. This kind of really poses a question. When you cut that brain in half, there's two people inside. There's literally two individuals inside of the body, which is very interesting to ponder. So let's watch this video.
Hey, welcome. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. But why did you click on this video? Not even 10 seconds ago, you were mindlessly scrolling through your YouTube feed, and then you saw this title and thumbnail, and something in your brain had to know what it was about, so you clicked. But what was that something in your brain? Seriously, tell me, it might get my click rates up. But for real though, we've got a motor cortex, a visual cortex, an auditory cortex. But where do decisions come from? That question got a lot more complicated in the 1960s when a new surgery started being performed on people with extreme epilepsy. It was called a Corpus callosotomy or split brain surgery. Yeah, try to guess what they do. Yeah, they split the brain in half. Of course, the brain is already pretty much split in half between the left and right hemispheres, but they're connected at the bottom by a bundle of fibers called the corpus callosum. So yeah, they just kind of cut those fibers. This made it so the two halves of the brain couldn't communicate with each other, which sounds like it would be a huge problem. But believe it or not, they went on to live normal lives. This surgery didn't change people's personalities or ability to function, but there were some kind of weird things that came out of it. You know, things like their left hand would start drawing something and they didn't know why.
Two
It's like there
people.
was something in their right hemisphere that was trying to communicate. They were kind of like two different people in there.
That's
So
crazy.
if that's the case, the question becomes which one of those two entities are, you know, running things.
Good question.
The subject of split brain experiments has come up from time to time on this channel, but I don't think I've ever really done a full video on it. So I decided to do one because this topic is one of those things that just really caused this shift in like how I see the world, how I see other people, how I see myself. It came from
Interesting.
a book that I'll be sourcing quite a bit in this video, and I highly suggest you read it. It's called Who's in Charge by the neuroscientist Dr. Michael Gazagana, taking
Interesting.
copious notes as you can see. He did pioneering work on split brain patients in the 60s and 70s. He's written several books about it, done TED Talks. I'll link it all below. But the reason this book speaks to me, if I may, I don't know, get a little personal for a second, I've kind of always had this theory that there's different gnomes in my head. Obviously, I don't think that actual bone gnomes are living inside my skull. That's crazy.
All right, so I know some people definitely relate, but not in the same kind of weird know me thing. If you've ever talked to yourself out loud, if you've ever thought in your head a specific way, not only is it like some people it seems to be weird when you talk when you're alone. I had one of my students going off AFK for a bit, and I was just talking to myself, organizing my calendar. She comes back like, I was listening to you talk the whole time. Why do you do that? I'm just like, just so I can make sure everything makes sense. And I told her it was okay to talk to yourself because it helps you organize your thoughts. And that does kind of pose the question when we talk to ourselves, when we think to ourselves, we essentially escalate this communication between the two sides of the brain, at least in my opinion. And that's why clarity can come out when you transcribe through words your thoughts. Because I would say, because both ears are listening, and because again, the hemisphere is split between the two sides, you would have one ear from the left side being attached to the right side of the brain, and another ear on the right side being attached to the left side of the brain. And based on the general form that the brain functions, creativity being on the right, being able to draw an object that you see on the left side of your screen, as discussed before. This was, I wonder if I still have, let me show you this one. This was an actual old video here. So he's shown the word pan on the left side of the dot. He's told to look at the dot, and there's nothing on the right. This man has his fibers disconnected. He didn't see anything. So now he closes his eyes and lets his hand draw. And he draws a pan. So odd. The speech is on the left side of the brain, but the right side of the screen was empty. So it didn't really register anything, so he didn't see anything. But that's because his speech is the response to the right screen, and his creativity is the response to the left side of the screen. So when he closes his eyes, he desensitizes himself, lets his hand do the process, and it ended up drawing a pan. This kind of poses the question again, who is in charge? We have two parts of the brain that can be disconnected, and when they're disconnected, they still function fair, but decision making comes from what part? Which I think it's both, based on the type of creativity and the type of logic that's necessary for that decision. And there's another one. So a wheel on the right and a car on the left.
Information goes to his disconnected right half brain. And as we can see here, Joe is unable to name it. But Joe is able to draw the picture with his
He
left
can't
hand,
vocally
the
name
left
it,
hand getting its major control from
but
the
he can
right hemisphere.
creatively describe what he saw.
What'd you draw?
Okay.
What'd you see?
Wheel on one side. I don't know what I saw on the other.
So even though he can't name it
He saw the wheel, but he didn't know what was on the other side. He couldn't vocally respond to the left side because it is the left side of the hemisphere for speech. And then the interesting one again.
so just close your eyes and draw with your left hand.
Saw a hammer.
Okay.
The stimulus of the picture or word that we presented to his right half brain. What did you see?
Saw a hammer.
His vocals, left
Just
side,
close your
saw a
eyes
hammer.
and draw with your left hand. Just let it go.
His left hand is now controlling his, or his right brain is controlling the left hand.
That's nice. What's that?
Saw
Yeah. What'd you see?
hammer.
What'd you draw that for?
I don't know.
He doesn't understand why he drew it, which is mind boggling that it's the same person experiencing this one process, and he doesn't even understand why he's doing it. Which,
That with Joe is a just a dramatic example of a neurologic case that really allows you this window into the non-conscious and how powerful non-conscious processes are in
yeah,
influencing our conscious self, our personal self. What Joe and patients like him, and there are many of them, teaches us is that the mind is made up of a constellation of independent, semi-independent agents, and that these agents, these processes can carry on a vast number of activities outside of our conscious awareness.
absolute.
Even though that goes on, there's some final stage or some final system, which I happen to think is in the left hemisphere, that pulls all of this information together into a theory. It has to generate a theory to explain all of these independent elements. And so, and that theory becomes our particular theory of ourself and of the world.
So the left tries to make sense of the world, but when you disconnect the left from the right, now the left only sees on the right side of your eye, not being able to understand the other side. So otherwise, the connection of the brain would kind of pass all the info from both eyes to the left so it can kind of make sense of what it's seeing. But when you disconnect it, now the body responds physically to the left side of what he saw, and his vocals respond to the right side of what he saw, which is crazy to consider that we can have a literal split. I mean, this would be the entry to split personalities. The fibers in the middle potentially could be a, I don't know, a bridge that was disconnected naturally from the body, disintegrated, in which a person can act in different ways, respond in different processes, and maybe think they're two different people at once. But that does kind of pose the question, who is in charge? Like, is it the left brain or is it the right brain?
But like most people, I imagine, I do have kind of different voices in my head that have thoughts that bubble up from time to time, some of which I don't even agree with. Call it a defense mechanism,
True.
call it a rationalization of bad ideas or whatever, but that was kind of my way of explaining why I sometimes had conflicting ideas or had trouble making a decision, or like the negative thoughts that kind of take over sometimes. That's the
Mm-hmm.
negative gnome taking the wheel. Not much
Yeah.
unlike the world that they created in the movie Inside Out, which I just saw for the first time fairly recently. And I've got to say, like the way that they structure that world inside of her head to explain how memories work and emotions work, um, I thought it was brilliant. Something else I liked about the movie was that the stakes were so small, but it still felt like a big thing. Like the climax of this movie is a little girl telling her parents that she's sad, and it carried more emotional weight than all these movies where like the world ending is at stake. Anyway, the point is
True.
that this book and the split brain experiments that he talks about in this book seem to make the argument that my little gnome's explanation for how my thoughts work isn't too far off the mark. And that free will and consciousness is just an illusion. There's a lot to unpack here. So maybe we could start by asking the obvious question, which is, why were they cutting people's brains in half again? Yeah, it's a procedure called a corpus callosotomy, and they started doing it first back in the 1940s as kind of a last resort treatment for severe epilepsy. Here's how it works. When you have a seizure, what happens is that there's a surge of electrical signal that disrupts the normal firing of neurons across the brain. Depending on where this occurs in the brain, you'll experience different symptoms. For example, an ocular seizure might give you a flash of light. But the worst, of course, are the ones that spread over the entire brain. These can lead to temporary paralysis and convulsions, vomiting, basically everything you think of when you hear the word seizure. And in people who get these multiple times a day to the point that they can't even function normally and no treatments seem to stop it, well, the best option is to just contain it. So the corpus callosotomy is done to prevent the signals from spreading to the entire brain, so it stays in whatever hemisphere it started in. Kind of like a surge protector. The first corpus callosotomy was done in 1936 by a neurosurgeon named Walter Dandy, kind of an accident. He was removing a tumor on a patient's pineal gland, and it required him to cut through the corpus callosum to get to it. He reported that this had no real effect on his patient, which there had been a debate for a long time about what the corpus callosum was actually for. Like, was it actually involved in processing, or was it just structural, just kind of there to hold the brain together? The result of this experiment seemed to suggest the latter. Regardless, in 1940, William P. Van Wagenen decided to try a corpus callosotomy on an epilepsy patient, and he saw mixed results at first, but they were promising enough to continue experimenting with it. By the way, this is all starting to sound kind of familiar. All of this happened about the same time as the lobotomies, which I covered fairly recently. This was basically the period of neuroscience when they started paying attention to the white matter fibers and cutting connections just to see what would happen. I should be clear though, while lobotomies were being handed out like candy, split brain surgeries were much more extreme and pretty controversial at the time, actually. This was only for people with a very specific, very debilitating condition, and even then it was only a last resort. It really wasn't until the 60s when two neuroscientists named Joseph Bogan and Philip Vogel kind of perfected the procedure, and it became thought of as an effective, safe treatment. But not without a few weird side effects. Like sometimes they had trouble getting their two hands to work together. One patient talked about how he had trouble buttoning his shirt because he'd be buttoning it up with one hand, and then his other hand would go behind it and unbutton everything that he had just buttoned.
Oh,
and
that's
stories
crazy.
like this just kept coming up, like patients whose hands would just grab things for no reason or would mess with the other hand, to the point that Joseph Bogan decided probably somebody should research this. Luckily, he knew just the perfect person to do this, a neuropsychologist named Roger Sperry. Roger Sperry was born and raised in Hartford, Connecticut, and went to Oberlin College on a scholarship where he originally wanted to major in English, but he took an intro to psychology class that sparked an interest in psychology. Yeah, the story goes that apparently his professor was disabled, so Roger Sperry kind of helped him to get around and took him to various places and stuff. So he wound up kind of sitting in on conversations that this professor was having with his colleagues, talking about their research, debating different psychological theories and whatnot, and he just got sucked into it. He just found it fascinating. So he got his master's degree in psychology and later a PhD from the University of Chicago. And then he went into his career, he became more interested in neuronal specificity and brain circuitry. Basically, like how different parts of the brain work and how they're connected. He did experiments on rats and salamanders that involved kind of rewiring their nerves, like in their legs and their eyes, to see if they could adjust. Spoiler alert, they couldn't. But through all of his research, he kind of became known as an expert in how different parts of the brain work and how they talk to each other. So, of course, Bogan thought that he would be just the right guy to study split brain patients. And, of course, Sperry took him up on it because what an amazing opportunity. He did also do some experiments on animals before he went into his human research. I know none of us like to hear about animal experiments, but he did do some corpus callosotomies on some cats and tested them. Luckily, he didn't have to do the surgery on the split brain patients because, well, that had already been done. So Sperry found a group of Bogan's patients that were willing to volunteer for his tests, which focus on vision, language, and motor skills. This would involve showing words or images to the left or right visual fields to see how the different hemispheres handled it. This requires some explanation. As you may already know, the hemispheres are what they call contralateral, meaning the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. Also known by its technical term, crisscross applesauce. But your eyes are a little bit weirder. It's not quite as simple as just each eye goes to the opposite hemisphere. They go to both hemispheres at the same time. What happens is the two optic nerves converge at a spot known as the optic chiasm. And there they split apart, with one split carrying the left visual field and the other one carrying the right visual field.
That's crazy.
And then the left visual field from both eyes gets sent to the right hemisphere, and the right visual field from both eyes gets sent to the left hemisphere.
That's crazy.
So it's still contralateral, but with extra steps. So if you're staring at my
Extra
face
steps.
right now, Zoe is in your right visual field. You're seeing her blessing you with both eyes, but it's the left side of the brain that's processing that image. Your right hemisphere literally can't see Zoe right now, but it knows she's there because the left side's sharing that information through the corpus callosum. But what if you don't have a corpus callosum? This is what Roger Sperry wanted to figure out. So he came up with a series of tests along with his graduate student, Michael Gazagana, the guy who wrote this book. Sorry, I just have to clarify one more thing before I get into the results of that test. A lot of the basic functioning of the body takes place in what's called the subcortical region. This is an area that's actually shared by both hemispheres of the brain. This includes structures like the thalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and a lot of other things that you probably never heard of. But these kind of handle the basic stuff like motor control, sensory processing, something they call proprioceptive sense, which is basically our sense of our body's position in space. So that's handled before everything gets split up. There's no one hemisphere that controls that. This also includes what Dr. Gazagana calls an integrated spatial attention system, which is basically something that directs where the brain pays attention to things. So it's not like you could be doing homework with one side of your brain and gaming with the other side of the brain. That'd be nice, though.
That'd be cool.
I know that was a lot of exposition, but it's just all stuff you kind of need to know before we get into the good stuff. So here comes the good stuff. So one of the first patients that they studied was a man named WJ. They kept their names anonymous for obvious reasons. WJ's test started out pretty simple. They showed him pictures and words in a right visual field, and then he was able to respond with his left hemisphere. A dog, a car, a spoon, easy. Easy because the language center is on the left side of your brain. But when they showed an image in his left visual field that went to his right side of the brain, he claimed that there was nothing there. Now, this was a really big moment because up to this point, there was still a bit of a debate around how much the corpus callosum controlled the flow of information between the two hemispheres. And this seemed to be indisputable proof because it wasn't that the right hemisphere couldn't see the object. It could see it just fine. It's that the language center of the brain is in the left hemisphere. So it literally didn't have the words to describe it. So based off of this, they tried a new experiment, this time with a basic flashing light. So what they did was they put his hands under a barrier so his eyes couldn't see his hands. And he gave each hand a button. And he told him whenever he saw a flash of light to click the button and then confirm it verbally by saying light. So they signaled his left hemisphere, he clicked the button, he said light. Then they signaled his right hemisphere. He clicked the button and then said, hey, why did I click that button? He didn't see the light, but the right hemisphere did. And it was able to communicate that it did. It just couldn't do it with language. It's kind of like the left hemisphere has a voice and the right doesn't. But now they were figuring out how to talk to the right hemisphere. And now things get a lot more interesting. These kind of results bore themselves out over and over and over again with other split brain patients as well. Like in one experiment, the left hand was placed in a box with a handful of objects in it. And then they flashed an image of the object in the right hemisphere, and the left hand was able to feel around and pick out the right object. When they asked the patient why he grabbed that object, of course, he had no idea.
Didn't know.
And sometimes the patient could just draw the image. For example, they flashed an image of a bike at the right hemisphere of one patient, and then his left hand drew a bike. But think about the experience that the patient is having. He's just sitting there, he's got a pencil in his left hand, and he's waiting for them to flash an image at him. And he's waiting. And then his left hand just draws a bike. These experiments would progress and become more complex over time.
That's insane.
And they began to understand just how different their left and right brains really are. You know how we always talk about left brain people being analytical and right brain people being more creative, that whole thing?
Right.
Well, here's how the two hemispheres are actually different. Basically, the right hemisphere was better with visual and spatial skills, and the left hemisphere was good with language. Like he described an experiment where the patient was flashed a picture of a pattern of colored blocks, and then he had to recreate it. And when they flashed the right hemisphere, the left hand was able to recreate it really easily. So the right hemisphere was really good at that. But when they did that with the left brain, the right hand it really struggled with it. In fact, there's one story of a patient who was struggling to put it together with his right hand, and his left hand kept trying to help. He had to actually sit on his left hand to keep it from trying to help the right hand out.
That's crazy.
According to Dr. Gazagana, quote,
wow.
The right hemisphere turned out to be specialized for such tasks as recognizing upright faces, focusing attention, and making perceptual distinctions. The left hemisphere was the intellectual. It specialized in language, speech, and intelligent behavior. There were also differences in logic and problem solving between the hemispheres. Like they'd show the right hemisphere a picture of water, and the guy would point to a picture of water. Then they show the picture of a pan, and the guy would point to a picture of a pan. But when they asked what they could do with those two items, the right hemisphere just couldn't quite figure that out. whereas the left hemisphere knew right away that you put the water in the pan. The right hemisphere also
Ah,
struggled to come up with
interesting.
inferences. Like in another experiment, they showed a picture of a match and then a picture
So, okay. So the right hemisphere is the identifier. It's able to look at and identify things, objects, shapes, and forms, but has no idea on the function of them. So you identify or you see a pan, your right side sends the pan to the left and says, hey, what can I do with this? And then it determines intelligently, oh, we could put it together with the water to make, I don't know, something, right? Start cooking. Or oil, or whatever liquid that you use for cooking. So right brain is the identifier, and the left brain more like the initiator.
picture of a wood pile, and they couldn't quite figure out that the next image in that series should be a burning wood pile. And in another experiment, the patient was shown the letter U and asked to turn it into a square using a choice of shapes, and the right brain couldn't do it, but the left brain had no problem. Like the right brain is very literal. Things just are what they are. He uses the example of a box of candy. So like if somebody gave you a box of candy, your right brain would just be like, yes, that is a box of candy. But your left brain will try to figure out why they gave you a box of candy. What this means is that both halves of the
Okay,
brain are experiencing consciousness, but
that's
very
crazy.
different kinds of consciousness. As Dr. Gazagana puts it, quote, it was becoming apparent that the right hemisphere had its own rich mental life, quite different from that of the left. So right away, we can see that there's not just one consciousness going on inside our minds, there's two. But it actually gets crazier. Turns out, it's actually multiple modules inside each of the hemispheres that can display a kind of consciousness. And they have their own things to say. So you remember earlier when I was talking about,
What?
trying to imagine what it must be like for these
It
split brain
goes deeper.
patients when their left hand just kind of randomly does something beyond their control, how weird that must be. Well, Sperry and Gazagana were wondering the same thing. So they began developing tests to see how patients explain these actions. Like the left brain normally has a gigabit internet connection with the right. They're sharing everything. But now it can only get information from seeing what the brain does externally, from the pictures that it points to and the words that it writes and whatnot.
Hmm.
And if the left brain is more interpretive and wired to find patterns, what would it interpret from that? Turns out a lot. So in one experiment, a patient was shown a chicken claw to his left hemisphere and a snow scene to his right. He was then asked to choose a picture that related to what he was shown. So his right hand pointed to a picture of a chicken, which obviously makes sense because the guy saw a chicken foot, but then his left hand pointed to a shovel, which makes sense because his original picture was a snow scene. But he didn't consciously see the snow scene. So when they asked him why he selected that shovel, he said, quote, oh, that's simple. The chicken claw goes with the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed. The left hemisphere, without
What?
hesitation, came up with a justification for what the right hemisphere chose.
Interesting.
I don't know, which would
That's fun because that would mean that people's assumptions sometimes can take the best of them, and even though they don't quite understand why they chose the thing they did, they're going to justify that thing that they do simply because it didn't say I don't know. The right said that? Hold on, which side?
goes with the chicken. Why he selected that shovel, he said, but he didn't consciously see the snow scene. So when they asked him why he selected that shovel, he said, quote, but his hand pointed to a shovel, which makes sense
Left hand.
because the guy saw a chicken foot. But then his left hand pointed to a shovel.
Left hand, right side. Creativity. Creativity is the stubborn one. Creativity is the one that's going to justify itself. Logic is going to try and rationalize with itself. What an interesting situation.
Don't know, which would have been the correct answer. It didn't say, oh, maybe it's this, I'm just guessing. No, it confidently declared chicken poop. And this was a result that repeated itself over and over and over again. In another example, the word music was flashed to the left brain, and a photo of a bell was flashed at the right brain. He was then given several images to choose from. These images were all musical instruments, by the way, including the bell. So the patient acknowledged that he'd read the word music with his speaking left brain, and then his left hand, controlled by his right brain, picked the bell image. When asked why he picked the bell over all the other musical instruments, the patient said, quote, well, the last time I heard any music was the bells banging outside here. There was a church across the street. Again, the left brain, having absolutely no idea that the right brain had seen a bell, confidently came up with a justification. One
That's
more example of this
crazy.
was an experiment where they flashed the word red to his left hemisphere and the image of a banana to his right hemisphere. He was then asked to draw a picture with his left hand out of an assortment of different colored pencils, so he picked the red pencil and he drew a banana. But when they asked him why he drew a banana, he said, quote, "It was the easiest to draw with his hand because this hand can pull down easier." Which, by the way, makes absolutely no sense. But that's what the interpreter came up with.
What?
And this was the name that they gave it, by the way. They call it the interpreter module. They also
Huh.
found the interpreter module hard at work explaining emotional triggers. So, for
Huh.
example, in one experiment, they showed the
Justification
right
for
hemisphere
emotional
a scene
actions.
from a fire safety video where a guy gets pushed into a fire, and the patient just reported that she only saw a white flash, but then afterwards she noticed a change in her mood. She said, quote, "I don't really know why, but I'm kind of scared. I feel jumpy. I think maybe I don't like this room, or maybe it's you. You're getting me nervous." In another experiment with a female patient, they flashed the picture of a pinup girl to her right hemisphere, and then, without knowing why, she kind of snickered a little. And when they asked her why she was laughing, she said that they had a funny machine. Like, have you ever had a random mood change? Like, suddenly you just get angry or sad, and you don't know why?
Yeah.
There's stuff going on in there. And in
A
case you
lot of
haven't
weird
noticed, in
stuff
every
going
single
on
one
in
of these
there.
examples, the interpreter module was wrong. Often confidently wrong. It got limited amount of information and assumed it knew everything about it.
Assumptions.
Might as well call it the Dunning-Kruger module. And yet, this module is kind of running the brain, or at least navigating our thoughts. Its further testing revealed that the interpreter module is just one of multiple modules in the brain, all of them kind of black boxes. Like, we don't really know how they make their choices, but they make choices, and then the interpreter module justifies it. Like, for example, fMRI tests showed that different areas of the brain would light up before a conscious decision was made to, say, take an action or to say something. That was a decision being made before the decision was made. This is basically how we live our lives, just walking around justifying the decisions and thoughts that pop into our heads from various random semi-conscious modules in our skull. This fact
That's
has
crazy.
been such a revelation for me because I don't really think of my thoughts and my actions as me doing it anymore. You know, I mean, yes, it's me. I'll get to the theory of mind around it in just a second, but it's a lot easier to look at your thoughts and beliefs objectively if you don't think of it as being part of you. Like, when I have a thought that comes up, I don't know where it came from, so I can just ignore it if I don't like it. You know, it's not tied into my sense of self. My ideas aren't my identity. And it's
Yeah.
a lot easier
Well,
to change your mind on something if you don't have it tied to your identity.
that's
Also,
fair.
once I understood that our brains are just constantly justifying things, just justification machines, basically, I find myself often just kind of pausing and asking myself, like, what am I justifying right now? Usually when I'm procrastinating on work. Like, here's a crazy thing that we do. Have you ever noticed, like, that you felt anger or annoyance at someone after you've hurt them in some way? Um, I mean, like we've all done it. We hurt people's feelings. We failed to live up to a promise, betrayed someone. It happens. That's life. But there's a psychological phenomenon that happens where, like, we know we hurt someone and we feel bad about it, but then that justification module kicks in and just sees that, you know, you feel bad and it has something to do with that guy. Well, that guy must have done something wrong. And then you wind up feeling resentment toward the person that you hurt, which is crazy, but we all do it. We are constantly justifying bad behavior and bad habits in the service of comfort or protection or just a dopamine hit. That's normal. It makes us human. But the awareness of it can kind of change your life. But the
Yeah.
other mind-blowing part of it gets into questions of free will. Like, what is actually controlling our decisions? There are some that make the argument that this disproves free will, that our decisions are made by patterns of neurons firing in a predetermined manner, that we're not even consciously aware of our decisions at all. These guys call themselves determinists. Taken to an extreme, one might make the argument that nobody can be held accountable for their actions at all because they weren't the ones that made the decision to take that action. Yeah, seriously, try that in a court of law. It doesn't work. And this obviously can also be used by people who justify bad behavior because, well, I'm not the one who chose to do it. Obviously, this is a bit of a philosophical slippery slope. Like, you know, how do you have justice and accountability in the world if there's no free will?
Yeah.
But also, how can you have free will when your decisions aren't your own? To find an answer to this, we have to go a little bit deeper into the nature of consciousness itself. It's time to talk about emergence theory. In Dr. Gazagana's book, he talks about the quantum world and how it operates on vastly different rules from the macro
Ooh.
world. We talked about it here on this channel a million times. These atoms and
Nice.
subatomic particles that just don't play at all in the Newtonian or even Einsteinian rules that we experience. They mostly exist in probability states, actually.
Yeah.
They manage to come
That's what I was thinking. How do we make a decision based on modules in our brain that function in separate formats? It's all based on probability. It's all based on the moment in time that something happens and the chances of you particularly being in a specific mood or a specific way or whatever emotional kind of balance you're going through at that moment, and the probability that you're going to respond correctly or whatever correct really would be versus uncorrectly, aggressively versus calmly, right? That would be one case, responding calmly versus responding aggressively. But then that would be linked to the quantum world, where probability is the judge of decision making, or the situational event of something happening would then be somehow connected to the function of the brain itself by proxy of atoms. That's insane. Hold up.
Together and combine to make physical matter. The air you're breathing, the chair you're sitting on, the building around you,
Yeah,
even
basically.
yourself.
Yup.
This is emergence theory, the idea that objects in one system can combine to create something entirely different in another system. And Gazagana talks about two forms of emergence, strong and weak emergence. He explains, quote, there are two schools of thought on emergence. In weak emergence, the two properties arise as a result of interactions at an elemental level, and the emergent property is reducible to its individual components. That is, you can figure out the steps from one level to the next, which would be the deterministic view. Whereas in strong emergence, the new property is irreducible. It's more than the sum of its parts, and because of the amplification of random events, the laws cannot be predicted by an underlying fundamental theory or form an understanding of the laws of another level of organization. An example that's always used of emergence is how millions of individual ants with very basic programming can come together and build giant ant colonies that are basically superorganisms with organization and structures that would be impossible for any one ant to conceptualize. One could draw the same conclusion about people, like forming cities or people forming the internet. But our brains work the same way. Actually, we have a few different levels of emergence. We have the atoms combining together to make the organic molecules that comprise the neurons. You have the neurons firing in patterns that create this
Electrons.
subconscious module that's going on in your head. And then you have the multiple modules coordinating to create our lived experience of consciousness. Actually, it's kind of funny. I've talked about octopuses in the past on here and how they have this seemingly alien
Octopi.
form of intelligence where they essentially have 9 brains because each arm has a little mini brain controlling it with an executive brain that sort of manages all of it.
That's
It's
cool.
like a hierarchical brain system that I've always thought was fascinating because it's hard for us to even conceptualize that.
It's like
But it
your
turns
hands
out, in
having
a lot of ways,
brains.
our brains work pretty much the same way. We have multiple semi-conscious modules that coordinate at times and jockey for position at times, with an executive justifier module that takes in all their signals and tries to make sense of it. And again, determinists would look at this and say that it's all pre-wiring, we have no conscious control over it, we are basically that guy from Men in Black with the Christopher Walken looking alien in his head. Drink the coffee. So yeah, our feeling
I
of
do need
free
some
choice
coffee.
and agency over our actions is a bit of an illusion. Except, hold on, that doesn't make sense, does it? If our thoughts and actions are hardwired and controlled by some wizard behind the curtain, then how do we explain neuroplasticity? How do we learn new skills? How do we get better with practice? The fact is, according to the book anyway, consciousness is a result of both bottom-up and top-down causation. We are simultaneously making decisions on a subconscious level, but also shaping those decisions at a conscious level. It is possible. It's not easy, but it's possible to change a pattern of negative thinking by being aware of it and replacing negative thoughts with positive thoughts. We do have, to various degrees, conscious control over our emotions and thoughts. In Dr. Gazagana's words, quote, action is made up of complementary components arising from within and from without. That is how the machine, the brain, works. Thus, the idea of downward causation may be confusing our understanding. What is going on is the match between our ever-present multiple mental states and the impinging contextual forces within which it functions. Our interpreter then claims we freely made a choice. I guess to put the question of whether we have upward or downward causation in simpler terms.
Maybe both is happening at the same time.
So, do we have free will? Yes and no. A lot of our decisions, it seems,
Maybe.
are hardwired and out of our control. But ultimately, we do have conscious control over our actions. We do have agency. This isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. Sadly, if you want to commit a crime and get away with it, you're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way. Be rich. Anyway, there's a lot more in this book that I couldn't fit into this video.
That's insane.
It goes on into how our brains work socially, how we have mirror
fucking
neurons
markets.
that cause us to mimic other people subconsciously. It's a fascinating book and definitely worth a read. I'll put a link down in the description. But again, for me, there's actually something kind of freeing about the idea that there's a lot going on up there that I don't have control of. I don't have to beat myself up for my thoughts. I'm able to give myself a little grace when I mess up.
Yeah.
It's just a much better headspace for me. Yeah,
Yeah.
ironically, the idea that I'm not totally in control is kind of freeing. It gives me objectivity and it makes me a lot less reactive. I
Okay. Keyword objectivity. Hmm. How do you even go about talking about this? I guess in a specific sense, one can use empathy, the ability to look at another person's life and to put yourself in their shoes to see what actions you would take in certain situations. That's one way to be objective, to look outside of your own consciousness and determine ideas and actions and events or whatever that may happen and observe them in a way that you are not letting your own biases get in the way. And that's an important factor of growth, personal growth, um, general growth, and just emotional and mental growth for sure. So the things that one would normally consider, like this is something that's completely lack if you play any game online, especially in Marvel Rivals. Some people absolutely have lack of this. As soon as something goes wrong, or as soon as they feel like the team isn't doing as good as they should be, they just become toxic. Oh, this person this, that person that. Oh, you should be doing this, or you should be doing that. That kind of person has no sense of external stimuli. They're only stuck inside of their own head. In fact, that's the hero syndrome. That's the fact that, you have some person playing one character. Everyone's like, all right, we're a team. We have to balance out the group. You be this, you be that, you be that. And then one guy goes, no, I don't want to be this. I'm going to be this because I'm so good. And normally that's the damage guys. Can call him the. Can call him. What can you actually call him? I mean, hero syndrome, one way or another. The jocks. They just want to do the thing and just be the solo player of the whole game, right? The quarterback, or yeah, I guess quarterbacks are pretty decent on the level. Running backs, potentially. And there's a lack of objectivity when you're looking at situations where you're completely influenced by your own stimuli, by your own internal conscious subconsciousness. That's a good point. Objectivity has a direct sense to this. I mean, it's a direct result of the senses of this. Once an individual can identify that they have this sort of ambiguity in them, that's not generally, not every single thought is exactly the thought. I've had so many times I'm driving in the car and I'm just driving, driving, driving. And for some reason, I just picture myself going on the other lane and just smashing into another car. Never did it, obviously. I'm still alive. But I just kept wondering, what kind of dark bullshit is this? Like, is that a thought that I'm having? Is that like a projection from a third perspective? Like, am I getting some sort of harp brainwave manipulations? Like, what was that? And generally speaking, it's just one of those events that happen in the brain. It's just one of those things that the brain can do. It decides to figure and see it out. It's curious. If you play games enough, you'll see these kind of events happen. If you play racing games, you can do that and see the results of that, which are not good, obviously. But in the game, at least it's a game. But in real life, it becomes very odd. And some people get scared of these thoughts and they run away from these thoughts and they consider them dark thoughts, and they are dark thoughts. But I want to really think of them more of like experimental thoughts, just the curiosity of what it would look like if that was to happen. If your brain can imagine it, basically, and your brain's like, my brain particularly, for some reason, they decided to make that happen. Um, there's many times that I've thought about inflicting pain on myself, and I could, as if, feel that I was doing it. Like as soon as I'm thinking about it, I just like maybe paper cut between the fingers, and I just hold my hand like, ah, right. Um, and so that's the worst, honestly. Is I honestly know the worst is getting stabbed in the armpit because this would have like all of those joints and stuff, and then you wouldn't be able to move your arm down. For some reason, that's my worst fear. Um, but those are the things that sometimes pop up as a thought. So in a way, it's not that it's abnormal or odd or dark or makes you any different from anything else. It's just your brain experiencing different thoughts, and sometimes it decides to do some dark thoughts because of existence, because of the mortality of the matter. And it's like, hey, what would happen if? And then it just plays it in your head. So that's very interesting. Objectivity is that fact too, is observing that and not being afraid of it and being accepting of it and saying, okay, that thought just happened. Who knows why, but it did. So let it pass. You don't have to be affected by every single thought. And you don't have to make, like you said, you don't have to make your own thoughts your identity. You can pick and choose which ones you identify with. So you don't have to be completely locked in with those thoughts, which is a key reference to just generally you choosing what you want to be versus you letting your subconscious choose for you. Or external stimuli, mainstream media, teachers, college professors, parents, girlfriend, boyfriend, friends. It's a balance of these stimuli to create you based on the choices you choose on which ones to take into your personal life and personal standing, not just to let everything affect you as if it's just it happens. It must be that way. I'm gonna take it in. Now it's a part of me. Interesting.
I truly believe that my life has been made better by having this understanding. And that's why I talk about it so much. That's why I made this video, because I genuinely think it can help you too. And even at a societal level, like if everybody had this understanding, I think we would be a lot better to ourselves and we'd be a lot better to each other.
Yeah.
Something else I can honestly say has made my life better is developing new personal hygiene habits. Specifically, when I stopped using cartridge razors and started shaving with this bad boy,
Okay.
the Henson razor.
Okay. Advertising. So I like this guy a lot. He's really cool. Super nerdy. Joe Scott. Like him. I'll potentially throw him in the chat uh, before I log off, but I gotta get ready for some students now. So I shall be going soon. Well, I'll be going now, really. So there's a pin. If anyone wants to see that, go for it. Like and subscribe to them. It's pretty cool. Anyway, I gotta do some student stuff. Got some math to help out with. Super student, super teacher, super tutor, whatever. But I'll probably pass out after